Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. For those who don't know me, I'm Anja Belinsky. I am the Associate Dean for Foundational Science in the Medical's Dean's Office. And I want to extend, on behalf of the medical school, a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our keynote speaker, Andrew Zimmern, who I've heard will appear from behind the curtain. Thank you also to Elisa Roth from NPR, who will lead the discussion after the talk. Some of you may be aware of the Medical Discovery Team history. The Medical Discovery Teams, and addiction is one of 4 teams, is actually a state-funded initiative. And it's a $150 million initiative over 10 years. And with big money comes big responsibility. And so we see this not only as an endeavor into academic excellence, but also as an outreach and benefit to the community. And the event today is one of those, goes on to this agenda. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Mark Thomas, who has been until recently the team leader of the addiction team and has recently been named the director of the team. I think Mark has done a truly outstanding job overseeing the broad scope of the team, advancing the science, advancing community outreach beyond the university. And I want to thank you and your research team and also the administrative team. And I think the event planning was led by Dory Henderson. So thank you very much for this. These events don't usually organize themselves. So without further ado, I hand it over to Mark. Thank you.
Now I'm blushing. Thank you, Dean Belinsky. So I'm honored to represent the Medical Discovery Team as director, and on behalf of our team, to introduce our distinguished speaker today. The goals of our team, as Anja mentioned, generously funded by the people of Minnesota, are to use state-of-the-art science to develop new effective therapies to target this difficult problem of addiction and to dispel the stigma that so often accompanies it. We're working to develop new non-addictive pain medicines, vaccines that can render addictive drugs ineffective, ways to map the brain to predict those most likely to relapse, and to target brain circuits to disrupt drug craving that can lead to relapse. So forming the addiction MDT really galvanized our existing research efforts through the medical school. It brought us the opportunity to recruit talented and creative faculty here to Minnesota. In the past 2.5 years, with MDT support, we've hired 11 new faculty who are just awesome. And we're starting to realize what we can achieve with these talented newcomers in our midst. So the event today is co-sponsored by Recovery on Campus, by the University of Minnesota Bookstore, the Chris Wivholm Foundation, Minnesota Recovery Connection, and Learning Life and the College of Continuing and Professional Studies. So thank you to each of these organizations for your support and for the good work that you do in our community. Our speaker for the 3rd annual public lecture on addiction is Andrew Zimmern. Andrew's a chef, a writer, a teacher, a world traveler, and, as you'll see, a wonderful storyteller. He's a native New Yorker, but he moved to the Twin Cities nearly 3 decades ago seeking treatment at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. After rebuilding his life around sobriety, Andrew found success as a television personality on Travel Channel's Bizarre Foods franchise. He's won 4 James Beards Awards. He's written 4 books, and he's an entrepreneur in residence at Babson College. He's the founder of Intuitive Content, a television and digital production company, and Passport Hospitality, a restaurant and food service development company. He's devoted to his charitable endeavors. He sits on the board of directors for services for the underserved and taste of the NFL. I got the chance to meet Andrew during the taping of his new show, What's Eating America, on MSNBC. We have a clip from that show. He's a thoughtful, concerned citizen, and frankly, a mensch. We're lucky to have Andrew with us here today to open up about addiction and recovery. Before I turn it over, I just want to remind you that there'll be time for questions and answers at the end, moderated by Elisa Roth, who's here from NPR, who is the mental health correspondent there. If you have a question at any point, please raise your hand, and our volunteers will show up with a card for you to write your question. So without further ado, introduce you to Andrew Zimmern through this video.
It doesn't take us long to find a group of people sitting on the sidewalk surrounded by hypodermic needles.
What's up, guys?
We're okay.
How you doing? You guys cooking up some drugs here, or what's going on?
Hey, Dave, there's an open needle right behind you.
All right. See a lot of syringes. You guys using drugs here?
No. Dozens of works recently used.
We're not here to jam you up. We're not here to take you to jail. We're here to help you out.
Rather than progress right into treating this as a criminal offense situation, the officers are actually approaching this as a how can we help you situation.
Hillary is 28 years old.
I'm gonna search you for more drugs, and then I'm gonna talk to you about some programs that we're involved in to give you some options on how to get to a better place.
Hillary, how long have you been using?
Off and on for about 10 years.
10 years. Have you ever tried to get clean?
These folks don't need to be taken to jail. What they need is an opportunity to get off drugs. You give them the dignity and respect that LEAD offers with all their other services, like finding a place to live, then you're actually one by one solving the problem instead of throwing someone into the system that's not designed to solve the core issue.
Let's welcome Andrew Zimmern.
What's up, everyone? How you doing? Yeah, that's a clip from the addiction episode of our new series on MSNBC. It would have been awkward to show the clip with Mark, but you know, it's as desperate as he was to see it. He's going to have to wait 4 weeks, and so are you. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you, Anya. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to Elisa for helping out with all this. Thank you to the university and to the medical school and to our volunteers. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk about my favorite subject in the entire world, me. I am a recovering alcoholic and addict. I've been sober since January 28th, 1992. For that, I am very grateful, but obviously that means that I'm essentially all I ever think about. So any chance that I have to discuss more about me, I feel like I'm in the middle of a Steve Martin routine. I'm extremely happy. The issue of addiction and the issues around recovery in America are very, very complex. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I have actually, very few answers. As someone who has sort of been head, ass, and overcoat involved in this for 28 years, I leave my most days scratching my head as to why I'm sober today and so many other people are either dead or still struggling in their addiction. But I'll begin my remarks with this. I want to leave lots of time for question and answer because I'm consumed constantly with thoughts about myself in my own head. I know exactly what my story is. I'm going to share a little bit of that with you, but I want to engage in a conversation later on, which is what those two comfy chairs are all about. Elise and I will fill those very shortly, and we'll all engage in a conversation. There's a metric that I use in my life. I try to use it every day to decide when I'm going to open my mouth. Is it true? Does it need to be said? And if it's true and needs to be said, is it up to me to say it? And so really what I have to share with you today is my story. As I said before, I don't know that much about alcoholism and drug addiction. I do know a lot about recovery because I've dealt with that personally. I believe that as a sober person, I know as much about recovery as anybody does. It's a very, very, very complex issue. It is a social justice crisis in America. It is a problem for all of us to solve together. And I think the combination of science, spirituality, and simply being loved up by community, sprinkling people with dignity and respect, as you saw up there with our small little clip from what the LEAD program is doing out in Portland, Oregon, is the answer. I did come here 28 years ago. Minnesota essentially just loved me up and saved my life. I am a product of what you people gave me, and for that I'm extremely grateful. I was born in New York City in 1961. I'm 58 years old. I had my first taste of alcohol as a very young boy. Thanksgivings, holidays, when my older cousins would, give me a straw and a cocktail glass and tell me it was ginger ale, but it would be usually my father's scotch and soda. I remember my first blackout drinking experience. I was about 8 years old. My cousins did that thing where they gave me a glass of champagne and made me drink it. It wasn't malicious, just sort of, the normal sort of playful crap that happens between cousins at holiday times. And then we did that thing where you spin around with your head on a baseball, the knob of a baseball bat, out in the yard where we were playing sports, and that was it. I just keeled right over. I woke up on the couch an hour later. But I do remember, even more vividly, my parents were divorced, and my father would come over once or twice a week to collect mail and things like that and check in with my mother. It was a nice time to see him, in addition to the time that I got to spend with him as a child divided between two parents. And my father, the first 7 years of my life, his mission was to get me to make him his drink the perfect way, because he just everyone thought it was super cute to have a little kid make the father's drink. And I remember taking the first sip. I was somewhere between 10 and 12, I guess. And I remember the alcohol being more on the bottom, and I getting that strong taste of scotch. And I remember getting that just mild hit of euphoria a couple minutes later. And I vividly remember feeling my entire body relax, but more importantly, my brain telling me that I was comfortable. And that was the first time in my life to date at that point that I felt comfortable in my own skin, comfortable talking to my parents about whatever was on my mind, just comfortable. That moment is what I then chased for the rest of my using life, which was the next 20 years. I snuck sips of drinks from my dad's glass as often as I could. I started smoking pot the summer that I turned 12 up in Raymond, Maine, on beautiful Crescent Lake at Camp Moosehead, where we were getting high with our junior counselors or whatever, and then put it away, because when I got back to school, my friends, older siblings and stuff, the access was weird, and our situation with our parents was weird, and I wasn't relying on drugs and alcohol to sort of get me through the day. But all that changed the following summer when I turned 13 and started using every single day. I came home from summer camp. I have a summertime birthday. I just turned 13. My mother, for the first time in 5 years, didn't come visit me at summer camp. My dad came alone, which was a very unusual circumstance. My mother and I were very close. My dad had some sort of flimsy excuse about my mom, and she wasn't feeling well and all the rest of this. It just seemed odd that she wouldn't come, but there wouldn't be like, oh, she's not feeling well, she's going to come next weekend, right? And I got home from summer camp, which was an 8-week experience, and my father picked me up at the airport. Again, very strange. Typically, all the kids came home. We got on a bus. The bus did drop-offs in 4 or 5 locations around Manhattan where groups of parents collected their children at the end of camp. Just something was wrong. Something wasn't right. And my father picked me up at the airport. We hopped into a black car. We drove to New York Hospital, and there was my mother in an oxygen tent in a coma. And they had wanted me to enjoy my summer at school, at camp, a decision made for me by other people, by parents and caregivers who were 100% trying their best. 100% trying their best. But the message that I got was I was never going to get the truth. I was never going to get the truth. I was going to have to fight and insist and push and prod once again, because it had happened before in my lifetime in small little ways, most of which was just normal parenting. I just didn't process it the right way, where I was concerned that not only wasn't I going to get what I wanted, but I wasn't going to get what I needed. Wasn't going to get what I wanted, wasn't going to get what I needed. Just more kindling thrown onto this fire of alcoholism and addiction that would just get my brain, which is, with me, a defective box that sits on my neck, thinking the wrong way. I knew, looking at my mother, things were bad. I found out things were really, really bad. And it ended up being one of the 2 or 3 seminal moments of my life. Family disaster. My mother was away for years, never really regained her life back, and was in and out of hospitals, and needed special care throughout most of her life. Oxygen was cut off to her brain during a short surgery that she went in for during the summertime while I was away at school. And I knew that what I was feeling, well, let me back up a second. After seeing my mother, visiting with her, talking to doctors, the whole family was there, getting a lot of love and support for about 10 minutes at the hospital, I walked 4 or 5 blocks from New York Hospital up to what was my mother's apartment on 71st Street on the east side in New York. My father gave me a hug goodbye, told me to put a stiff upper lip on, that this was going to be the last time that we really talked about this, and that everything was going to be okay. And then he went downtown to his apartment, and I went upstairs where I met the caregivers that were going to be around me as I basically lived alone, sort of the ultimate latchkey kid in my mother's old apartment for the next 2 years in New York City. I was very independent. I had a lot of really good life skills. Fending for myself didn't bother me. I knew my father would be around a lot. I saw him a lot. And he was coping as best he could, but he thought that that was a really smart decision to let me stay in the environment that I was used to, be close to my school. He lived way downtown in the West Village. It was a very, very intentional decision on his part. He was doing the best that he could. He was an old Navy guy, you know, greatest generation. Let's just make the smartest decision that we possibly could. But there was part of it, too, I came to learn years later, that he just wasn't thrilled with the idea of full-time parenting again, right? My parents had divorced when I was 5 or 6. I'm now 13. He had very much a big piece of his own life already going. And many, many years later, in fact, about 22, 23 years into sobriety, in pursuit of more emotional sobriety, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I realized that it was okay to label that as abandonment. I could still put my dad on a pedestal to which he exists, in my mind to this day, the most amazing man I've ever known. But at that moment, he abandoned me. And it was a trauma that just reinforced other traumas that just continued to evolve into my life over the next couple of years until I took them over and added a lot more trauma to them. And the reason is because trauma that is not transformed is transmitted. And I learned, doing a lot of intensive work on trauma at a lot of different facilities around the country over the last 8-9 years of my sobriety, that this trauma has existed in my family with my grandparents and their struggles, not just with alcohol, although we believe my paternal grandfather was an alcoholic, but with the way they parented, with the way they talked or didn't talk about things with their children. All that was dropped off to my uncle and my father, and that was passed on to me. And that was just on one side of the family. My mother's side of the family was even more visibly messed up, but that's a story for another day. But the fact of the matter is that until you interrupt that cycle, and knock on wood, my generation has not contributed to the trauma to my 15-year-old. Hopefully we've intercepted that and are actually doing conscious parenting and dealing with him and his world in a much different way. Hopefully we have interrupted the trauma cycle. But trauma is a very, very, very awful thing for a young child. It's been explained to me that anything that doesn't nurture a child can be considered trauma. And the reason that trauma is especially troubling for a young alcoholic, because believe me, the minute that I got upstairs to that apartment, I knew where the liquor cabinet was. I knew where my mom's pills were kept. I knew what was available in the drugstore on the corner. This is 1974, by the way, where you could call the neighborhood chemist and just say, hey, mom's prescription is out. Can you send some more up? And whatever it was, uppers, downers, just came flying up 7 minutes later with the delivery kid from the drugstore. Same thing with the liquor store. 13 years old, call the liquor store. Hi, it's the Zimmerns. Just send whatever over. And all the bills were going to my dad's house. There was also $500 in cash, which was a fortune back then, in an envelope underneath the silverware tray, so that if anyone needed cash, not me, the caregivers in the apartment, there was access to cash, but I knew exactly what I wanted to do with that. So I started using hot and heavy right away, because I did not want to be feeling the feelings that I was feeling at that time. I didn't know it was abandonment from my father. I didn't know that it was despair and a grieving process for my mother. But what I did know was that I felt shitty and that needed to change. And I knew exactly what was going to take care of that. And so I started using every single day. I mean, I instantaneously became a daily drinker, daily pill taker, and daily pot smoker. Very quickly after that, as I went through the next couple of years of high school, because, you know, at that point I was off to the races, hallucinogens, cocaine, heroin all entered the picture for me. And by the time I got to college, I was fully blown as an alcoholic and drug addict. In fact, the first time that I had a medical intervention, 10 days into my freshman year at college, the drug counselor at Vassar College told me that I was chronic on the Jelinek scale. Something that an 18-year-old, quite frankly, I think most 18-year-olds just automatically reject. I I did not see the consequences in my life. I had been class president. I got into a really good school. I was, popular with everybody. I looked in the mirror and I saw a great human being. He was telling me that I had a death sentence, and I was, you're 18 years old. You're Superman. Nothing can hurt me. I had actually gotten to college, and in my high school, I went to high school in New York City. And the difference between, and I'm sure there's a great mix here of people who went to high school in small towns and suburbs, and people who went to schools in urban areas and cities. And in urban areas, our cities, most of us do a lot of drugs. We don't have cars. In the suburbs, I found people drink a lot and they have cars, right? It was the big difference. That is the difference between, that's the difference between all of us. There you go. Thank you. Good night. But the fact of the matter is that I was much better at that phase of my life I was a much better drug addict than I was an alcoholic. And I got to college and people had like kegs. I'd never been to a keg party until I got to college. We just didn't have them in high school. So I started drinking, and I came across this, fruity punchy thing. I didn't know it was loaded with grain alcohol. So, all of a sudden I was out, 2 days, blackout, picked up by the campus police, dropped off at the drunk tank in Poughkeepsie, New York, and then released into the hands back of campus police, where this whole thing was expunged from my record. And however, I had to meet with a drug counselor, D.B. Brown, who was the man who looked at me. And Dr. Brown, I spent a couple hours with him. I did some forms. I did some tests. I told him my story. And he was the first person who said that my behavior and my disease, he labeled it as a disease, was only going to take me to a handful of places: jails, institutions, and death, period. And that if I didn't do something about it, I was going to die. And I just did what all 18-year-old drug addicts and alcoholics do. I laughed at him. You're crazy. And I walked out of his office. Box checked. I had met with the counselor. It took me all of about a day and a half to realize that D.B. Brown was right, an opinion that I ignored for the next 12 years as I began to put together my career and try to graduate from college, which ultimately I did, which as an addict is extremely difficult to do. I dealt drugs in school. I lost friends in school. I marginalized people in school. I was cruel to other people in school. I was irresponsible in school, both to myself and to my community. I started crossing lines in terms of behavior that I never thought in a million years when I was a younger person that I would cross, especially in the cruelty and selfishness department. The way I treated women in relationships was typical of the selfishness that alcoholics all represent, but that wasn't who I wanted to be. The cruelty of taunting and bullying other kids that, I didn't want to hang out with was not who I was. That's not who I was when I was at summer camp when I was 13 years old. I was an inclusive kid. I was the one who was getting pushed around and bullied until I learned how to hit somebody else back. It wasn't who I was, but that's who I had become. I got into the restaurant business in New York City, and I had always cooked. Since I was 14 years old, I had cooked in restaurants during the summers. I had a natural gift for it. I had spent a lot of time in Europe on my frequent semesters off from Vassar College. Most of the request of the university that I think about where I was going, and mandatory semesters allowed me to do a lot of work on myself and my cooking skills, and I found that I had a tremendous aptitude for it. So I became very successful when I came after graduating from college with 2 degrees, one in history, one in art history, and went straight into the food business. The restaurant business in New York City in the early 80s was a fantastically wild place. I wish all of you could have seen it. It was explosive. The food world that exists today did not exist in New York City in the 1970s. It exploded in the late 70s and early 80s and became very familiar if you look back in time, it became very familiar in the 80s to what we have now. It was an extremely exciting time to be working and cooking in New York. Grand cafes were opening. The lifestyle was fantastic. There was a lot of drugs being consumed in the restaurant. There was a lot of drinking going on in the restaurant. And I found a lot of like-minded people who like to work extremely, extremely hard and then let off a lot of steam after work. I like to let off a lot of steam after I let off a lot of steam, and New York is a great place to do that. So there were after-hours clubs, nightclubs, there were after-hours clubs, there were after-hours clubs, there were illegal clubs to go to where there was gambling, where there were girls, where there was more drugs and alcohol. And I found a way of living that I thought was working for me. I could make a lot of money in the restaurant business. I could steal a lot of money in the restaurant business. And I could party my ass off. And that's really all that I thought about. And as that behavior and set of behaviors became more and more a part of my regular life, I solidified for myself what I had started to see at the end of high school, my senior year, and certainly into college, becoming that person that I never thought that I would become. And it was in New York by the mid-'80s that I was firmly ensconced, in my opinion, looking back, as a user of people and a taker of things. That's what I did. I used people and I took things. A lot of people were very worried about me. I didn't care. I treated people like crap. I was only looking out for one person, and that was myself. I was unable to maintain relationships. I was unable to maintain the respect of my peers. I was able to hang on to jobs because I had the talent to do it. And in the meritocracy of the restaurant business, especially on the cooking side of things, I held on to many jobs simply because I could do the job better than other people. I'll give you an example. It was very popular in the mid-'80s in New York to open these 150-seat grand cafes, and brunch was a really big economic driver, right? Eggs at whatever, $12 a shot was a really good profit margin. So if you could put out 300 orders of poached eggs over the course of 5-6 hours from your station, you were a rock star. If you went to a fancy Italian restaurant at night, and I was sous chef and chef in a couple of these types of restaurants, and you could do 200 portions of risotto off of 4 burners over the course of 3.5 hours, you were a miracle worker. But I had worked in a restaurant in Venice for a summer that's specialized in risotto, and I had learned from the best, and I was talented at it, and I loved the pressure of it, and I didn't crack, and I was able to focus, because as an alcoholic and drug addict, and I'm sure there are some of you in the room today that can relate to this, I expressed an extremely high capability of both hyper-responsibility and hyper-irresponsibility. It was a roll of the dice in terms of what I was sort of playing into at the time, but that was a specialty of mine. Show up, do the job, crush it, then steal shit from you, then leave and go do my own thing. And in our addiction episode of What's Eating America, my old boss at this time and partner, business partner in a couple of ventures, remarked he would just disappear for a day or two at a time, but he was so good at his job, I didn't know what to do. Managing alcoholics and drug addicts has changed since the 80s. We now can name it, we can label it, we can express care for them. It's a little easier because the rest of us have the language of how to deal with that. We've understood how to express truth to one another, and there are more opportunities for help. But back in the 80s, this was like, you know, everyone's getting high. Everyone is doing this. And it was very difficult. We didn't have the language or the skill set in the rest of the world to sort of deal with this explosive problem, mostly having to do with the ebb and flow of our drug cycles here in America. We were in a boom time for drug addiction in this country back then in the 80s. Things quickly began to decompose. It's only a matter of time before alcoholics' lives just become completely unwound. I very soon became unable to hold a job. I very quickly lost my apartment that my father had co-signed for, a condo that I had on the West Side. And I had, I lived in one of these, I had a really nice condo that I had conned my father into helping me get. There were newspapers on the floor that were 2 years old. I mean, that just tells you everything that you need to know about that apartment. There is a sheriff in the county of Manhattan in the state of New York, and I was removed from that condo. It was then sold out from under me, and whatever money was gotten was returned to my father. All of my possessions went into a bunch of boxes that got sold on pennies on the pound sale. I was notified at some point about it. I don't remember it. And that night after I was evicted, I went down to drink at my favorite shot and beer bar. There's a whole bunch of bars in New York City that are, Dublin Saloons, Blarney Stones, that are shot and beer bars. They close for an hour, usually at 4 a.m., and open up again at 5 a.m. Because legally they have to close. At least this was back in the 80s in New York. And the guy said, "Hey, do you have a place to stay tonight?" I said, "No." And these were guys that I recognized from this bar. I wound up, I should go back a second. My friends had stopped talking to me several years before this, but I would acquire sets and groups of friends and hang out with them, and ultimately at night, after discarding all of them, I would find myself in this Blarney Stone, the cheapest drinks, and there were people there who drank like me. So at 4 a.m, I didn't feel weird doing a couple shots of, warm Popov vodka and chasing it down with, a 50-cent draft, right? And we were all drinking alcoholically because we were all alcoholics. And they told me they had a place for me to stay. So I crashed a building with them on Sullivan Street. We were squatters. It had casements in the windows. It was being, remodeled, I guess. We stole electricity from the building a couple doors down. I slept on a pile of dirty clothes that I had showed up there with me, my, duffel bag of whatever it is I was managed to carry out of my apartment, and would steal bottles of Comet Cleanser every day or two and just sprinkle them in a circle around my pile of dirty clothes so that when I passed out at night, or during the day or whenever, the rats and the roaches wouldn't crawl over me while I was resting. I thought that was normal. I thought it was normal for work because I was obviously unable to hold a job. By the way, there was no running water there. We went to the bathroom in a makeshift outhouse down on the second floor. I didn't shower for that year. My clothes turned to rags. The lunacy of my chemicals had gotten to me, and I was that person you crossed the street to avoid. I had long since, the series of apartments that I had gone through before then and wound up in the condo, when I was doing a lot of heroin, I moved up to 110th and Manhattan Avenue in the mid-'80s so that I could literally lean out my bedroom window and use hand signals to have the guys in the street gang that controlled the 2-block area I lived in run dope up to me. That's how I ran my life. down in the building we squatted on Sullivan Street, which now is a super swanky 3-apartment building with an Agnes B boutique on the ground floor, does not look as awful as it did when I was back there in the day. Much to my upset, because I bring people back there all the time, and I'm like, this was the horrible place I crawled out of. And they're like, looks gorgeous. Gorgeous. I mean, $3 million apartments stacked one on top of the other in a French boutique on the ground floor, and a great little breakfast spot across the street. And Sandra Bullock has a $20 million townhouse 3 doors down. I mean, it's a fantastic neighborhood. Was not that way back then. I would steal purses off the backs of chairs from restaurants on Madison Avenue. I knew restaurants. I knew where people kept their purses. I would see briefcases. I would see purses. I was much thinner then, and I ran much faster than I do now. And so I would walk by, grab the purse, scoot down to the corner, bang a right, head to the park, vault the wall, much better shape then, at 5th Avenue, shred everything, turn my jacket inside out, hold on to the passport, credit cards, and cash, walk calmly down to 59th Street, go over to 57th, get the train down to where all my old heroin dealers were on the Lower East Side, and sell them the passports and the credit cards and keep the cash. By this point, I should tell you, I did know something was wrong. And obviously, you got to change it. And what was wrong was drugs. They're illegal. And so I stopped doing drugs. I kicked heroin by using Quaaludes and weed and booze, and then quickly got rid of the Quaaludes and pretty much exclusively just drank that last 1.5 years of my using days. Horrific. That's when things just really went into the shitter, because I was completely out of control. And I continued to cross through barriers and cross lines that I never thought that I would do. I obviously had already become a criminal. I was a user of people and a taker of things, so what else is there? Well, I crossed a lot of moral boundaries as well. I was used to clubs, I knew restaurants, and I knew fancy apartments in Park Avenue. So I could break in or con my way into apartments that my friends' parents lived in and steal from them. I knew the nighttime scene in New York, so I would hang outside down the corner from the cool nightclub in Tribeca, and at like 3:30 in the morning, the rich European businessman that was kind of waddling down the street like this, always pick an older guy. I would just wait for him to walk past this one alley. There was this one nightclub I loved to roll drunks in, and I would just push him against the wall, and he'd fall to the ground, and I would just take stuff out of his pockets and then just walk away. It was the easiest thing in the whole world. I mean, it was literally, to me, it was survival mechanism. It was stealing candy from a baby. The idea now that that's who I was, that was okay with me, it was a different human being, because in many cases it was. I had fallen through almost every safety net there was. I mean, there was not a moral boundary that I did not cross in my effort for survival. Ultimately, I found myself in a position where I felt one morning that there were winners and losers in life. I was clearly a loser. I thought back to what D.B. Brown had said about jails, institutions, and death. I had already been in lots of jails and lots of institutions. By the way, plenty of arrests. I sat in front of many judges in New York and begged to be thrown into jail or kicked to the curb, because standing in front of him was the only place that I couldn't get high. I knew I could get high inside, I could get high outside, but I wasn't getting high in the courtroom. There was no drunk tank in New York in those days. You went straight to Bellevue. Bellevue is where they process drunks. I probably was in Bellevue 20 different times. I I ate meals at the Salvation Army or wherever I could, you know. My life had become one that during flickering moments of consciousness, just wasn't what my plan was. You know, I remembered back to the little kid that I was before my mother's accident, before I started using on a daily basis, and I thought to myself, what happened to that guy? And I felt that I was clearly beyond human aid, and because I didn't believe in anything bigger than me, right, I was a survivor, you know. My dad had told me to fend for myself, and I made him happy and fended for myself. I was just following instructions. And this is where my life wound up. And so I decided the smartest thing to do, and this is just one of those great moments, like, what do you do at that point when confronted with that and knowing in your gut that you are a lost soul? Well, you call up the people you love and beg for help. And you finally get honest, right? That makes all the sense in the world. To me, what made all the sense in the world was break into my godmother's apartment, steal a bunch of jewelry, take it across state lines, because I didn't want to bump into anybody in the jewelry district in New York hawking this stuff at the pawn shops there, because those are the only pawn shops that I thought would give me the right amount of dollars. So I went to New Jersey, to Hoboken, hawked a bunch of stuff, came back with a fistful of cash, went to a Flophouse hotel, put it down on the table, told the guy, give me a room, hold my calls, went across the street, grabbed a case of vodka, went up to the room that I was given, and decided I was going to drink myself to death. That just seemed to make a lot more sense than ask another human being who cared about me for help, right? Perfect alcoholic thinking. And so there I was, drinking myself to death in that hotel room, the San Pedro Hotel that no longer exists, and it didn't work. It didn't work. And I woke up one morning, whether it was 3, 5, 8 days, I couldn't tell you. Something like that. Single digits. Let's go with 5. And I literally, I was chugging vodka until I passed out and wake up and chug vodka some more. And I just thought, I'm so sick and I'm so weak and my body is so shot, I'm just going to not wake up one time. And that's okay. And I woke up one day and I, for the first time in my life, did not have that ace bandage of tension and anxiety in my chest. I had had that ace bandage of anxiety on my chest since I was 3 or 4. I never remembered not having it, except that one day that I took that strong sip through a straw out of my dad's drink and got that shot of scotch in my system for the first time. That was the only time. And that was what I had been chasing my whole life, was just that feeling of not feeling like I was compressed inside of my own soul. And I did something that I had never done before. I was the guy, when I went into a room, I ripped the phone cord out of the walls, right? Remember, 2 years of newspapers on the floor? I went over to the wall, plugged the phone back in, called my friend, and said, I'm at the San Pedro Hotel, can you come get me? And my friend thought that I was dead. My parents thought that I was dead. Several more of my friends thought, anyone who kind of was keeping tabs on me thought I just disappeared for a year, and they just assumed jail or dead, but they went with dead, because that's sort of where I was in my using cycle. And 2 days later, I walked into a coffee shop to have dinner with a friend of mine. And there were 20 people who loved me very much, and they gave me a one-way ticket to Minnesota, $20, a pack of smokes, and a set of clean clothes and a bag, and said, good luck, don't come home, go get well. And not my first intervention, but the first one where I actually, listened to what they had to say, went out to the airport, got on the late-night flight to Minneapolis, got out at Carousel 14, where a driver from Hazel and Betty Ford, or what is now Hazel and Betty Ford, drove me up to Center City to begin my current sobriety, and that was January 28th of 1992. Now, I will tell you that this was an extremely, extremely delicate time in my life. I was on the medical unit there for an extended period of time. I was very unwell. But when I got down onto the unit, I was surrendered. I would have sobered up in a liquor store at that point. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And a couple of really fascinating things happened to me, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions about recovery now that I've qualified in front of you as a real alcoholic. I did everything that I was told, which I had never done before. I completely turned my thinking around. The person who had never cared what other people had to say became the person who just did what other people told them. The first person at the first meeting that I ever went to, I asked him to be my sponsor. He's still my sponsor today in a 12-step group. They told me to go to meetings and to not drink. I went to meetings and I didn't drink. They told me to be of service to other people, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. That is the foundational cornerstone of my life today. They told me not to go back to New York. I didn't. They told me to do the work that was in front of me and listen to whatever it was that the communal wisdom of the recovering community told me to do, and I did. I was not compliant. I had tried compliance before. Compliance didn't work for me. I was fully surrendered. I was certain. I had religious certainty that listening to other people would give me better results in my life than if I was making the decisions on my own. It was a very, very freeing experience. Trying to tap back into that is the dragon that I chase today. The same way that I wanted to chase that feeling of euphoria and relaxation that I had when I tasted my first drink, I now chase that feeling of the first 6 months of my sobriety. It changes. You can't keep it that green, but you got to keep trying. So if there's someone out there who is in recovery, that's what I chase. And I do it a couple different ways. I still go to meetings. I don't sponsor as many guys as I used to, simply because I travel so much, I'm not capable of it, but I have 4 or 5 guys that I continue to sponsor, and just got a new one in New York a couple of days ago. Super thrilled about that. I am a keen student of how to make myself a better human being. Day to day, week to week, don't know how to measure it. When I try to measure day-to-day, week-to-week stuff, I inevitably fail. Because my concern right now is not that I'm going to drink today, it's that I'm going to be an asshole today. That's my default mechanism, is asshole. So day-to-day, week-to-week, I make mistakes. Month-to-month, do I become less of a jerk? Absolutely 100%. Progress, not perfection. I hope sometime, maybe in the next 20 years of sobriety, God will choose to remove the assholery from my life. But I work at it. Some things that I have found that really work for me that I want to make sure I leave you with before we go to questions. The first one I mentioned before is service, service, service. I fully dedicate probably 25% of my income and 25% of my life to doing service work. I consider this service work. Coming here, sharing my story with other people is service work. Volunteering to cook somewhere is service work. Talking to other people who are in trouble is service work. Serving on boards, all the rest of the stuff that you do with your life to try to help someone else without a predetermined outcome or benefit for yourself, actually, it turns out, has been the thing that gives me the most benefit in my life. When I am doing that, that is my medicine. Because for someone who constantly is thinking only of themselves, who inside, still in some ways is a user of people and a taker of things, doing service work takes me out of my own head. I'm not worried about myself. Everything is great in my life when I'm doing something for someone else. It has never, ever, ever failed me. Ever. Not once in 28 years. I've never left an experience where I'm doing something for another human being feeling worse about myself. Ever. There is... what's the best way to express this? I'm very publicly sober. I've been very public about it and very transparent about it because I want people to see that people, regardless of how far they fall, can actually become productive members of society and pay taxes and have a family and essentially try to be a good person, right? So I'm very public about that. But I am not public at all about the nuts and bolts of my 12-step program because my 12-step program that I'm a member of requires anonymity. However, what I can tell you is this. I am a regular member of a 12-step program. That 12-step program has a text that it uses as its foundational support and educational tool. That text has a paragraph in it that is how I run my life. And it's at the bottom of page 84 of that text, if anyone is ever curious about it, or if anybody in this room is also a sober member of a 12-step group. And it's a very, very important piece of my daily living. And the instruction at the bottom of that page, 84, says if you are feeling anger, resentment, jealousy, or fear, you must do 4 things immediately. And I love clear-cut direction. I do not like ambiguity. I want the answers. I'm my father's son. You tell me how to get from this end of the room to that end of the room. I want to know how to get there. I will do it. I will get it done. I'm very competitive. And it tells you to immediately say a prayer. It tells you to immediately talk to another human being about it so it's not inside your head. It tells you to make amends for it if you need to. That does not mean apologize. That actually means do something constructively to make it better. Could also mean apologizing to a human being, but it's not limited to that. And then the 4th thing it says is to do something for another human being, because love and tolerance of others is our code. It does not say do something for another person in recovery. It says another human being. And that's what propelled me into service. I had been doing service before in the recovering community the first 5-6 years that I was clean. But when I started doing service both inside and outside of the recovering community is when my life exploded into another dimension that I cannot even tell you how ecstatic and blessed and grateful and humbled I am to have had that transformation in my life. And it is literally because of devoting my life to that paragraph at the bottom of page 84. I mentioned emotional sobriety at one point at the beginning of my talk. Emotional sobriety is very important to me. For people that, stay sober more than 20 years, at a certain point you realize there's a lot more. And so whether it was intimacy, whether it was trauma, I try to go away every year somewhere and do, a weekend program, a 3 or 4 day workshop, stuff like that. So that it's, some people call them tune-ups. I love them. I love them. And I go away and work on myself. And one of the things that I learned at a workshop, actually for a family member of mine, where I was there as a parent, I learned something that has changed a lot of my thinking over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's this, and I will leave you with that, and then Elisa and I will converse and ask questions. We all know as human beings that there's a part of us that's hardwired to be lotus eaters, right? We would like to be happy. I would like all of you to be happy. I would like all people in the world to be happy. It would be like a Coca-Cola commercial. You know, if there was more happiness in the world, there'd be less of all the other crap that I think is distracting and harmful to us. Sounds very kumbaya, but I think it's a very, very simple thing. If you want to be happy, how do you achieve that? Well, a lot of people that I think are much smarter than me, you know, from, you know, the mountain of wisdom that's written on this subject about how to be happy. One of the things that everyone sort of comes away with is that if you have more empathy in your life, you will be happier. Well, that's no help at all. That's taking something that I thought was hard and making it harder by putting a harder word on top of it. I mean, happy, at least I can kind of, you know, do we need more clowns, tell more jokes, better food, cooler shows on Netflix? I mean, that makes me happy, right? But empathy, oh my God, how do I even begin to do that, right? And I heard something really brilliant once. And it was a lecture about dogs from a dog trainer. And I've kind of given it my own little spin. You've all heard of Hitler. That's funny. You got to be really ballsy to tell a Hitler joke when you're talking at university, but this is a great one. Hitler had a dog, famously, right? Hitler's having a really shitty day. It's the end of the war. He's in the bunker. He's one of the worst human beings in recorded history. And he comes down to the bunker, and he's thinking, I'm going to kill myself and my girlfriend tomorrow, and we've lost the war, and I'm never going to see the sunshine, and I'm living underground, and bombs are going off everywhere, and this didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. And he plops on the couch, I assume at some point in exasperation, to have a little schnapps, and Rover hops up onto the couch. And what does Hitler's dog do? Hitler's dog puts its head in Hitler's lap and just lays there, and then puts his little paws up and kind of goes to sleep. The dog is the most empathetic creature there is. The dog does not ask Hitler, how was your day? Doesn't judge him. Boy, you were pretty stupid in 1933. If you just go on another direction and maybe tried to hold an open fire, the dog doesn't do any of that. The dog is just there being with Hitler, right? The dog is the most perfect empathetic creature that there is, right? So the lesson in life, if you want to be more empathetic, is just remember to be the dog. Just be the fucking dog. If you are then the dog, then the happiness will come, right? And I will give you an example from my real life how this worked, and then we will adjourn to your questions. I was at my house, and my wife at the time came running in. I heard her pull up, screeching. Car comes in, and she's just on fire. The work was terrible, and I lost my phone. I don't know where it is, and had the number for the thing I got to do tonight, and how am I going to call to pick up the kid? And blah, and she's just, having one of those moments that we all have. Everything just collided at once to make this horrible intersectional moment for her in her day-to-day blocking and tackling of her life, right? I told you I'm not really afraid of drinking today. I'm afraid of being an asshole. So I had an option at that moment. I could do what I was about to do, which was, did you call the security guard at the office and see if your phone was returned? Right? Now, if I had said that to her, and believe me, there were lots of other times where I said that, She looks at me and says, "You are such an asshole. Of course I knew. Don't mansplain that shit to me. I am a functioning, smart human being. Of course I knew to check with the security guard at work. That's the first thing I did, you moron. I just came home and dumped my soul, just vomited it onto the ground, and all I want is my husband to say, oh my God, that sounds awful. Let me get you a glass of water and let's talk about it." That's empathy, right? If I say to someone, "Did you call the security guard to find out where the phone is?" Wall goes right up. Screw you, right? I mean, I get it. I get it. Done that my whole life. When you sit there and say, "That's awful. Let me get you a glass of water. Let's talk about it." Wall comes down. At that point, my wife says, like, "Oh, I called the security guard. He doesn't have it. Do you have the phone with the thing?" "Yeah, absolutely. I'll go get the kid, blah, blah, blah. You sit here and relax. Put out the fires, blah, 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 blah." Right? We got the landline. Do whatever it is that you need to do. Right? Come home with the kid. An hour later, everything's fine. She solved all the problem. That night in bed, she looks at me and says, one of two things, depending on what I did. "You are the biggest jerk in the whole world. You're my life partner. You have to stop acting that way, or this isn't going to work." Or she says, "Thank you for listening to me. I just needed my best friend." I don't know what you want out of your life. I would like situations in my life to resolve themselves the way the latter example does. I believe that we're all better off if we can just be the dog. So thank you very much for listening. I'm encouraged every time I come into a room and get a chance to share with a bunch of people about the thing that's nearest and dearest to me. Apologies to Mark for not playing his clip. Elisa, do you want to come up? Let's talk to these folks, and I'm going to be signing some books, I think, in the lobby. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that amazing story. As Andrew said, we're looking forward to hearing from you all, so we'll start the conversation, but please send your questions forward. You are 28 years and 3 weeks sober, is that right?
I am something like that. Let's find out exactly.
I may have counted wrong.
Let's find, no, I like, exactitude is very important. I am 10,248 days clean.
Okay. And you said you don't worry about drinking anymore.
No.
It sounds like it's a daily, it's at the top of your head every day. It's something you think about every day.
I think about it every second. And you are only, I believe very much that as a recovering person, we're always an arm's length away from a drink. I mean, that's old time, 80-year-old recovery wisdom, right? Always an arm's length away from a drink. I think I've learned after a lot of time and a lot of work that if you're actually engaged in daily actions in your life to make your world a better place, if your heart is in it, if you start your day on your knees asking please, if you end your day on your knees, literally or figuratively, no judgment, saying thank you, if you do the stuff that's in front of you and sort of take your medicine that keeps you sober, you're actually, after a long time, you're an arm's length and a quarter inch away. Today, I kind of I got to lean in to that drink. I have, for as long as easily the first 5 years I've been sober, always said that I have lost the power of choice when it came to drinking. And I realized one day when those words came out of my mouth, oh my gosh, the promises really have come true. It's almost as if the problem has been removed from me. I'm arm's length and a quarter inch. I've got to make an actionable effort to do that. I am more worried about being an asshole than I am about having a drink today.
So the drinking question came up in a couple of these cards. What is it like traveling around the world, trying all these different cuisines, being offered food, being a guest? Mm-hmm. What happens when alcohol is part of that in some way?
I tell them I'm allergic. Never fails. Ever. And it's hysterical, the translations for this. We had some difficulty in a gear in rural Mongolia. Mongolia, if you stand in the middle of Mongolia, you are further away from people than at any other place on planet Earth. I'm in a ger and with this gentleman Dashka, who was my age, and his family, and we're shooting the show, and they work hard all day long, and then at night everyone gets blackout drunk. Grandma, Dashka's wife, Dashka's brother, Dashka's brother's wife, everyone but the kids, and they just get hammered. And they're insisting that I drink. We tell them I'm allergic and I can't. I get very sick if I do. And he has absolutely no understanding. And then I can see him switch up the whole thing. And he picks up his little daughter, super cute kid, and he's kind of barking at me. And he speaks a dialect of Mongolian that is not spoken even in Ulaanbaatar. I mean, he's a nomadic person from generations, thousands of years of nomadic people, and speaks an old tribal language. And our translator is trying to figure it out. And at some point, I see the translator waving wildly behind me. And our director at the time is hitting the translator, just stop it, you're distracting. This is this beautiful moment. The child, Andrew, Dashka. So we have this beautiful moment, and he hands me a bunch of bloody sheep's knuckles, and they play this game where you roll the knuckles. They have bags of knuckles, some dried blood, years old, some very fresh and new, and we're rolling the knuckles, and stuff is happening. He's high-fiving, and the daughter, and all the rest of that, and our translator is waving, and Chris, our director, is literally hitting him in the chest to get him to shut up and pipe down. And the moment ends, and we kind of stop shooting, and the translator says, Dashka has just wed your son to his daughter. And what Dashka was saying was, well, if you don't drink, let us join houses. It was like Game of Thrones. Let us join houses and unite. And the running joke with a bunch of friends of mine who were there that day is, at some point, my son's now 15, Dashka's daughter is 14. In 4 years, when she's 18, there's going to be a ring on the doorbell, and there she is. So other than that, all good.
How does your son feel about that?
He doesn't. I don't tell him. Oh. It is interesting, and there are a lot of other places along the road where it trips you up. I have a rule about if I don't have any business being there, get out of there. So at night, if you're shooting in Paris and you have an established show, in other words, the government shows up and they want to take you out, and you have to say yes because the tourism department's going to waive the $15,000 fee to shoot a walking shot of me in front of the Arc de Triomphe, and so you go out with them and all the rest of that. And I have the two things in my life that continue to befuddle me, that I feel powerless over on a daily basis, is anything involving romance or finance. Anything. If it's money or romance, it's a distraction. I want to know what it is. I got to hunt it. It's just a distraction. And at France, they've got they ask lovely people to come and join us for dinner, an actor and this and that person, and seated next to me is some supermodel. And I'm just I don't know what to do. I'm just this is like a gift from God. I don't know. And I realized at that moment, as some people, everyone's dancing, and someone lights a joint, and I realized this lovely woman, just to be nice, is putting the joint in her mouth, and I realize she's going to come over and she's going to shotgun it into my mouth on the dance floor. And I literally did this thing that I've seen other people do when I've gone to give them a hug, especially very devout Muslim women who don't like to be touched by anyone other than their husband, and even then, not in public. I did the Matrix thing where I'm just like, oh my God, and I was in the van so quickly, because to me, that's, as a recovering person, that's kind of how the disease shows up in my life. If you aren't vigilant, then things can happen. But I try to stay vigilant. So my kid got married, and the cute girl didn't get to shotgun the dope down my throat. And
you have to make sacrifices.
I've let them both down, and I apologize. If they ever see this tape, I'm sorry.
Another question here about the restaurant world. It's full of people who have substance use problems.
Twice the average, national average.
I remember this, I mentioned this to you earlier. I remember when I was working in a kitchen in Baltimore, alcohol was just part of it. There was the guy who kept the bottle in his toolkit. He would bring over his Coke and ask me to take over to the bartender. Can you get him to put a little rum in for me? But then it was also very open. At the end of the night, we all got a beer. That was just part of your pay. Is that changing?
Yes. Should I expand?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't think I knew of a restaurant in the 80s where shift drinks weren't part of the equation. I have restaurants. I'm a partner in several others. I'm in restaurants all the time. I don't know of, I mean, everyone I know in the business has said, yeah, no, this is work. Because part of professionalizing it, if you're an accountant, at the end of the day of your CPA work and all the rest of that, you're like, wow, that was a big big day on the adding machine. Someone doesn't break out a bunch of drinks and has at it. So in an effort to professionalize our industry, I think many people are seeing like, it's done. Go home. Have your life. So there's no more 14-hour I shouldn't say that. Everyone is working towards no more 14-hour shifts, no more 70-hour weeks. Have some, we're going to try to give you health insurance. There are restaurants now that are offering childcare because restaurants are still the #1 employer of single mothers in America. We're changing the way we do things in the restaurant industry, and the restaurant industry is actually now leading on this. Places that give shift drinks, sure. Does the corner burger bar with a small crew of 3 or 4 people, do the guys come out of a kitchen after a long day and get a beer? Absolutely. I assume that still happens. But none of the restaurants that I'm associated with or my friends' restaurants even do that anymore. And it's not because they don't want to do things for their employees. In fact, they're doing more for their employees. The have a drink used to be a shitty excuse for, we're going to treat you like shit. We're going to treat you like shit while you're working. We're not going to pay you enough. We're going to make you work longer hours. You're not going to get any benefits. And if you step out of line, you're going to lose your job. And by the way, part of our pay is in cash, and we know you like that. So the easy thing is to let you have a couple of drinks. Instead now, we're taking away the couple of drinks and doing childcare and health and wellness and health care and normalized hours and a living wage.
What are you seeing in other industries and other parts of society in terms of promoting the healthcare, the sobriety? It astonished me when you talked about getting to college and making it all the way through a fancy private school in Manhattan and nobody's saying, hey, what's going on? Making it through college, even with the stops and starts.
Everyone said, hey, what's going on? I just told everyone to go take a hike. I mean, the doctors, lawyers, girlfriends, parents, friends, teachers, policemen, firemen, camp counselors, everyone was like, there's something wrong. Hey, let's talk about it. And I just told everyone, nope, everything's fine here, nothing to see. I mean, at a certain point, it's on me. Other people can't be working harder on my recovery than I am. Eventually, the more you ignore other people, it's why I say to people all the time, I don't know if anyone follows me on Twitter. Anyone? Yes. Occasionally I get recovery questions, and my answer is the same to everyone. Immediately put down the phone, go find one human being in your life and tell them your truth, period. And then let everything go from there. If I had gone at any one time in my life and told one other human being my truth, the trajectory of my life would have changed. I refuse to acknowledge my truth or tell other people my truth.
A question here from a professor.
Uh-oh.
Yes, watch out. What do you think is the biggest misconception about addiction that scientists can help educate the public about?
The biggest misconception about addiction that scientists can help the public with is to talk about the actual nuts and bolts of what happens when you put chemicals into your system. Now, the real addict or alcoholic won't care. It's more important to get high than anything else. Your spouse says, I'm going to leave you. Your boss says, I'm going to fire you. Your children say, I'm never going to talk to you again. And you still go out and drink. However, I think education and communication, those two things, I think solve more problems early on for a lot of people in a lot of situations than we ever give them enough credit for. And I think it may stop enough people in their shoes and incrementally begin to change the conversation. A lot of people are very, very confused about, well, this kind of pill, is that, do I get addicted right away? Do I not get addicted right away? What does this do to my body? Will I have a memory? Will I be able to function? Does it help? What does this help me do? What does it harm me from doing? And I think that more transparency and education about that kind of stuff is needed. I also think, look, one of the problems is we took counselors out of grade schools. Right there. One of the big things that I work a lot on in terms of mental health parity laws is getting budgets increased. So in public schools in America, we can get counselors back into grade school so we can identify young people for whom, when they take that first, drink or drug, they're going to feel that same sense of, oh my God, that I did, right? If we can get to them before that and let them know that there is an alternative path, I think we'll be a lot better off.
How are we on time, Mark? We're good? Do we have
1 minute.
1 minute. Do we have more questions for a last question? Yes.
How do you recommend overcoming trauma, since that was such a key part of what you did?
How do you recommend overcoming trauma? First thing we have to understand is that if anyone has not, we all suffer from it. There's not a person here in this room that has not been traumatized by events in their own life. You may not realize it. It may seem super, super, super small. It may have been just a regular part of what was going on in your family, but there is not a human being that is not affected by trauma in their life. The most important thing to me is to end these trauma cycles, because one of the things that comes out of trauma is the most are there any psychologists or psychiatrists in the room? Thank you very much. Feel free to scream out bullshit if I get, because I want to be accurate here. In my experience, on a nuts and bolts on the ground level, trauma is the most toxic of all human emotions. Guilt is actually okay. You can work with guilt, right? I feel guilty about something. Just saying, trauma is paralyzing, and trauma can be transmitted to other people, right? You can try to guilt someone out, right? It's kind of hard to. Other people put up their wall. You start shaming another human being, right? You start using some of the trauma-associated hurtful behavior, it can damage someone else and can be transmitted, right? So I would encourage everyone at some point in their lives, by the way, for some people, this is like the 30th thing you need to take care of in the next 10 years, because it's not affecting your daily life. For some of you, it may be one of the 1 or 2 things that is preventing you from being who you want to be today. So everyone has a different sense of urgency, and that's up to you and the people you talk to. But be honest with other people and talk to somebody about it. There are so many great trauma workshops being run at treatment centers, at clinics, in schools and stuff like that, where you can start to learn about trauma and move past it. I did a 4-day trauma workshop at Rio Retreat at the Meadows that absolutely changed the trajectory of my life and allowed me to finally come to terms with a lot of stuff and put bows on it and put stuff in boxes up in the attic of my life, dealt with, and that trauma not only doesn't affect me anymore, but I'm not transmitting it to my child and the people around me. So I think it's something that historically we have underestimated the toxicity of it, and we could all use to address it. And let me repeat, for some of you, the order of magnitude on it is, I'll deal with that later. For some of you, I'm one of them, got to deal with it now.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you.